It's always wonderful when we can have one of our graduates back on campus, particularly one that's so accomplished and has so much to say about the current state of affairs in the world. And so our conversation tonight between Melissa and Professor Mitchell should be one that we all can learn from and get a lot out of. Just so you know, this is not our last event for the semester. We have two more Overby events after this one. Our next one is a long way away. It's tomorrow night when we'll be talking about the history of high school journalism in Mississippi as the Mississippi Scholastic Press Association celebrates its 75th anniversary. And then in, I think it's 3 weeks, Monday. Well, I'm MSPA director, and I'll be leading that panel of former MSPA directors tomorrow night. Thank you, Leslie. And then on Monday, April 11th, then we'll have Berkeley Hudson here, Professor Emeritus from Missouri, who will be talking about the Owen Pruitt collection of photographs from Columbus, Mississippi between 1920 and 1960. So we'll be doing a deep dive into the history of that and the way that photojournalism can be used to capture a time and place, particularly one as interesting as Mississippi around the turn of the century and just after. So you want to make sure that you've got both of those on your calendar. Both will start at 5:30 p.m., just like we're starting tonight, and both, just like tonight, will be followed by a very generous reception immediately afterwards in the hallway. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Mitchell.
What's the difference between a very generous reception and a reception?
About $200.
Okay. Thank you. I'm the interlocutor. I get to ask the questions tonight. Thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight. Melissa Charbonneau was a student here, a few years ago, not many. And since then, after graduating with top honors, she has pursued a very varied career. She started out doing her due diligence in local television as a general assignment and consumer reporters for a station in Virginia. And then for 12 years after that, she was the U.S. Senate and White House correspondent for CBN News for 12 years. She then transitioned into consulting and she spent a little time with public television and WETA. And then she became media liaison for a NATO-led security mission in Afghanistan. And then while she was in Afghanistan for about 3 years total, she also moved to the Bush Presidential Center's Afghan Women's Project, which was an empowerment project, as I take it, for women in Afghanistan. Along the way, she served 18 years as the Speakers Committee Chair for the National Press Club and organized their 5K run. And if she has another one of those, then RJ and I promise we'll participate. And since Afghanistan, she's worked as Director, Issues and Crisis Communications for FedEx in Memphis, and then moved to Miami as Director, Corporate Communication and Crisis Communications for Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines Limited, just in time, I believe, for COVID. Which certainly there was no relationship between the pandemic and cruise lines that she had to deal with. But back in the day, and I think it still may be true, we advised our graduates to hold their resumes to a page. Melissa can no longer do that. She would be a little bit more longer than that. So welcome to the Overby Center and the School of Journalism and New Media. And the first question, I've seen a little of your nostalgia around the building, but what are your best memories in this building?
Well, you walked me back to the old offices before this was even here, and I stood in the place where I walked in as a sophomore, and Dr. Pratt's, he was the head of journalism then.
Wait just a second, let's get sound right.
Your microphone not Sorry. Yes,
We can hear you here.
I was here, we were using 3/4-inch tape decks for television, which is 5 generations. But I was telling Charlie, thank you so much, that we were walking back to the original journalism department, and I stood in the place in Dr. Pratt's office. When I walked in there, I didn't know what I was doing with my major here at Ole Miss, and he said, "Why don't you sign up for journalism?" So I did, and it's been the beginning of a life that's been very interesting, and I'm very grateful for. And if I hadn't come here, it probably wouldn't have happened.
Well, we talked about you starting out kind of as a journalist in local television.
Yep.
And then choosing to move on from there. You think that's still a viable career path?
I think it's changed so much because of technology that there's so much social media involved now that when I was going into television, we were doing one story a day on air, had all day to work on it, and now I think it's 3 to 4, 5 stories, social media hits, live shots. It's just a really fast-paced process from the people I know in DC who are still in the biz that I think it's the way to go because you're exposed to so many things. You learn deadlines, you learn to write, you learn to consolidate, and they're skills you're going to use forever if you want to work that hard. It's a hard business, and I think much harder than when I graduated. But it's opened doors and given me skills that I can use. And if you're in news, if you're in just basic organizational communications, corporate comms, crisis comms, event planning, any of that, TV is a good start, and it's fun.
We're good. Then you moved to cover the U.S. Senate and the White House. So tell us about that.
I had I had worked at the local TV station and met a Russian reporter who had come over to Norfolk, Virginia and worked in our station, and she got me over to St. Petersburg, Russia, where I worked for about 6 months at the state television station there. And when I came back from there, I got a job in Washington, D.C. covering the Senate. So it was fascinating. You got to cover all of Congress. You covered the Supreme Court, policy issues, anything that came along, you would just be exposed to, and it was a daily turnaround. Covered congressional and presidential campaigns, interviewed Trent Lott, our homeboy, when he was head of the Senate, and Newt Gingrich when he was head of the House, and multiple presidential candidates. So it was a very exciting time. And then when a reporter left, I was moved over to the White House beat, so I covered the last 2 years of the Clinton administration, right around the Monica Lewinsky time. So it was a totally different type of coverage then, much less policy-oriented and much more what was going on at the time. Stayed there until the Bush administration. We were covering presidential elections. I remember I was sent to Austin on election night when you guys may not be familiar with the hanging chad, you may not remember it. But the night of the election, I was on a media stage in Austin in the rain. We were waiting to hear who the president was, and it never came. So then moved to the White House, covered the White House all 8 years of President Bush.
I try to make sure all my questions are fair. Who is your most favorite person to cover? Because you know what I'm going to ask next.
Honestly, I don't have a favorite. Everyone is fascinating, and I spent more time covering Bush.
Yeah.
And I got to spend more time with various policies and issues. I got to travel with the White House press corps around the world to G8 summits and to Russia when President Bush met with President Putin. I went to Africa and covered Laura Bush when she was down there working on the poverty and malaria initiative the president had. So probably because of the opportunities I've had and the longer time with Bush, I would go with that. But it was an exciting time during Clinton.
Yeah. Do you think that the Lewinsky matter really was a turning point in how presidents are covered?
It was for that time because there was such a crush of interest in that, and it was just daily news breaking, it seemed, that it totally shifted the coverage from the policies and the the strategies he was trying to push. And it was all what developed with Monica that day, what news is Linda Tripp, everything was, it was more soap opera and Inside Edition than, this is a policy we're going to handle and promote for education or the war on drugs or anything like that. So definitely. But I think when I was covering Bush, it did bounce back to that.
Yeah. We first, I think, reconnected on social media when you were in Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah.
So I was following your posts from there and thought your work was very interesting, and I think most of these people thought it was pretty interesting. So tell us about your Afghanistan years, how you got there, and what you were doing.
I had left at the end of the Bush administration, had left reporting and was doing PR. I was studying at GW, looking at doing documentary film production, and was working with WIDA up there, the PBS station that works with Ken Burns. And so that was fascinating. I was going that direction when a friend, an old colleague, came back from Kabul. He had been over there for a year working with the Afghan Media, building television stations and training them to do media. And after dinner with him, within 2 months, I had packed up my condo and was on headed to basic training at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, and then 2 weeks later on a cargo plane, landed in Kuwait in the desert and sat there in a tent for a couple of days, then flew into Bagram. So everybody's heard about Bagram now, and that's where we flew in, and I was assigned to the main ISAF, International Security Assistance Forces, the NATO mission at the time, was assigned to the headquarters, which was where the generals were who were running the war, so just right in the center of it. And I loved it because I went to school for journalism, and I was a journalist for many years, and then I got out of it, and you miss that. You miss the excitement, you miss the breaking news, being with the decision makers. So I was right back in it. I wasn't a journalist, but I was working with journalists and with the decision makers, and got very fortunate with that.
Did you have a presentation you were going to share with us a little bit?
Yes, let me get a sip of water. I pulled some pictures from then. It's been about 8 years, and I think my hard drive died, and I lost half of them. So some I pulled from online just to give you a little hint of what we did. But before, I was in Washington when I decided to leave, and I was working with the National Press Club. We do high-profile events with newsmakers, and we had as a guest Tom Brokaw. And so as we were talking, I mentioned that I was going to Afghanistan, and he said he had been there on many visits and doing reporting for NBC, and he said the one word I will tell you is that it's exotic. And that's what I remembered when I went over there, and that's what I saw. It was just beautiful landscapes everywhere you look. It was a poverty-ridden country, of course, and war-torn, but the Hindu Kush Mountains is what I woke up to every day. Just wide expanses, and I never dreamed coming from Mississippi that I would be on the border of Iran and Pakistan and all the other stands and China around. It was just a fascinating place, and I learned a lot of geography I didn't know before I went there. That's just a local street in Afghanistan. Actually, that's more built up than some of the other streets we visited. That's Kabul, and you see how built up it is. It was really...
Slow down.
Okay, you would see, you would go out we would go with armed escorts. I was not allowed. We lived on the main base. We had to go out with 2 Humvees and armed guards that carried long rifles to go out in the city. We would be driving through these narrow roads that were, half the time there were dirt roads and sewage lines along the side of the roads, and herds of goats, or goats and herds, cattle, and they'd be coming, it was just, once I saw a camel, but this next shot is an aerial of Kabul, and the military base, the ISAF headquarters, was right in the center. And it was a few months before I arrived there, it had been the target of bombings. They had built I think it's the northeast corner, there was a hotel being built, and insurgents had started lobbing bombs and done some damage within the headquarters area. If you look, that top right part over there, I think that's the football field, that area was the U.S. Embassy. And you can see their swimming pool to the right. They had a swimming pool. We didn't. Our ISAF was the military headquarters, was this area to the bottom. If you see the square, that is a soccer field. I lived in a trailer with 2 other women right at the corner of the soccer field, but that's what was used because it was so dangerous to go out in vehicles normally that you would have to catch a Black Hawk helicopter and fly wherever you're going. So if I was taking media to Bagram Airport to catch a plane to go anywhere in the country, we would have to get a Black Hawk to get over there. Driving was just too dangerous. So it was about a 15-minute flight, not too bad. It was so tiny. This green roof right here in the lower middle section is the headquarters where the commander, the ISAF commander, and all the generals worked inside a secure fenced-in area, top secret. The communications building is that little right above the green building. That was our communications headquarters. We were a mix of international public affairs, mostly military, some civilians who were there to support, but Americans, British, Australian, Italian, French, German were all working together. And this was that center building where the commanders worked. When I first went there, it was, the COM-ISAF was General John Allen. And then shortly after, this is where he would do, that was Nowruz, I believe, one of the Afghan holidays, and he would prepare remarks, record them, and send them out to the Afghan media for engagement with the culture. And we had our own camera crews. I'm sorry, this keeps falling down. We had our own camera crews and editors, and I was in charge of the production AV staff, so we would do that with them, and then transitioned to another general, Joe Dunford. You may recognize him. He later became chairman of the Joint Chiefs under Obama after he left Afghanistan. Another Boston Marine. You may recognize his face. This was our little studio that we did live shots with media back in the States or in Europe. And this was John Kirby. He was the captain at that time. He came to Afghanistan and got his admiral stripes, and now he's the Pentagon spokesman. Smart guy. This was our team of multinational public affairs staff, again on the rooftop with the Hindu Kush Mountains in the back. This was the communications department, the public affairs was that last one back there. Usually when I was there, it was fairly safe. I've lived in Washington and Miami and Memphis, and always this was probably the safest I've ever felt working. Of course, I was surrounded by a lot of men with guns, but we never had a lot of problems. Once in a while, we'd have some insurgents that would try to crash the gate in a vehicle with bombs, and some of the other bases had that problem. I slept one night with my 9mm under my pillow because we were warned that someone was going to break in. Never happened. But we did have, is that falling off? Do I need to take one of these off? Hello, can you hear me? Yep. And so, I was in the second floor of that building, and we started getting ordnance come in. And there was ordnance, it landed outside my window, unexploded, just right outside the window. And so instead of sending us home, they put us in our flak jackets and sent us to the basement to keep working. So that was a German communications spokesman, and that was British, and 2 Americans. And the Germans, the U.S. generals led the communications department. He was the commander of the war, was an American general. Then the British had the number 2 spot in command, and the Germans had the spokesman position. So they would trade off generals who would come in and do the press conferences and be the official spokesman, and I supported them. Of course, our mission was to promote the growth of the Afghan military and government and provide security in the capital region and the other regions eventually. But we also did a lot of outreach into the community. There was so much hardship, so much hunger, especially in the winter months, that our teams in communication would go out. This was a refugee school. We were providing food and gifts. All those girls, I wonder, that was about 8 years ago. They may be 15, 16, and now they're under the Taliban rule, and their lives have drastically changed from when we were there. They had a lot of hope, very sweet. There were girls and boys. Soccer was very big with the kids there. They hadn't seen cameras before. They loved that. Very sweet kids. We also worked very closely with Afghan Media, the local media. They were young. You can see a lot of young, aspiring journalists. There was a major TV station called Tolo that employed many of them. There were some NATO staff that would conduct training for them in journalism. And so they were growing, and we also worked with, there were women. Well, this is one that was an African-American photojournalist, and he was a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer for this picture. That's not a very good picture, but of a girl that was standing in the middle of multiple casualties after a suicide bombing. Bad picture again, but there were many, surprisingly many female reporters, and they were starting to really rise in the ranks. There were more of them. They were on the newscast daily. They would come to, there was mostly men. I would have one or two women come to our press conferences on base, usually very young. And I remember one was very timid and came to me, and there was an event going on, and she told me that they have such a difficult time covering events that are in the afternoon because they're not allowed out culturally. Their families and the businesses, the media outlets wouldn't allow them out after dark. And so we had to actually take that in consideration for every event or press conference we had, so that they could come and cover it. We would have to account for the timing for the women.
A quick question. A couple of those photos previously, you were wearing a scarf. Were you doing that out of respect or because you were cold?
Where? Oh,
Back one more.
well, the thing is, I didn't often wear scarves.
There. It appears.
Around my neck, but not my head.
It looked like you had almost.
And that was a personal choice. There were times when we went out and we were going in zones where there were snipers and it was risky, and we were with other Afghans, and some would take offense at that. And actually, if it would put others in harm, because if insurgents saw that women were with them and uncovered, they might more likely take some shots at us. And in those cases, I would. But often when we were working in places where there weren't snipers and it was safe enough, I wouldn't wear it. We were trying, personally, I wanted to set an example that women didn't have to do that. The minute you put on a scarf, if I was in a meeting with reporters and a local a local Afghan government official, you disappeared. The women who were military, they came in with weapons and helmets and flak jackets. They were treated like men. But if you were a communications person and had the scarf on, you kind of, and the journalists too, I noticed, they would gravitate toward the men. So it was a very cultural thing. But I did not wear that very often. The journalists we lived on a secure base. The journalists who we worked with, American, British, German, whoever, they lived out in the community. The BBC had a swimming pool in their news house.
And I detect some swimming pool envy here.
But they lived out there and they took a greater risk. And I know the women journalists, they felt free going out in the streets, but they would always wear a head covering. Not the burqas. We're in Kabul, there weren't as many women wearing the complete head to toe burqa. You would see it, but the scarf was usually enough. We also dealt with, in Kabul, when I got there, it was very, very highly staffed by media from around the world. So there were permanent stations, like from all the American networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, AP, Reuters, AFP were all there, BBC from London, a lot of the English newspapers, some German. They all had bureau chiefs, they all had reporters who continually covered it. So we would support them. We would take them out on embeds around the country. But this is Quentin Somerville from the BBC. He is now, if you read now, he is an amazing reporter. Even the reporters say he's an amazing reporter. He's in Ukraine now, providing a lot of coverage if you look for him. Quentin Somerville. He had 2 different color eyes, by the way. So we'd also have visiting reporters coming in who didn't live there, but would come in to do a couple stories and go out. Lester Holt came with NBC. Laura Logan when she was with 60 Minutes. Ollie North came when he was, it was July 4th. We spent a whole 24 hours on top of a building, bringing soldiers up to send hello greetings back to their families on July 4th. Wall Street Journal, we took him out to an embed. And this is how Afghanistan was broken up. The NATO nations handled different regions. So the purple, it says Zabul, but that's Kabul. So the capital region was mainly American. We handled Kandahar, and we handled the east, the light green, which was on the border of Pakistan. Paktika on the bottom right, that was one of the first tours I took some media to, right on the border, and we took media in to see, I'll tell more about that, but local tribal chiefs there, because that's where, when people were escaping, getting to Pakistan, those were the routes. Helmand, of course, was managed mostly by the British, but there was also, the U.S. had Camp Leatherneck. It was a big desert area. The west was bordering on Iran, so Herat was managed by the Italian and Spanish, and the north was all German. So when reporters came in, or reporters who lived in the country wanted to go out and do stories, it's so difficult for them to get around. You can drive out there, but it's unsafe, and some reporters did that. But even to get to the mountains or to these remote places, they couldn't do it alone. So that's why they had that we would create media tours to each of the regions, and we would arrange all the flights, get them helicopters, flights on the ground. We'd have armored vehicles, food, lodging, and we'd set up opportunities for them to interview the local Afghan government leaders who had been elected, the Afghan National Army, the ISAF military commanders, and so they would go out and get stories. We would set it all up for them and then let them go at it. So, for example, if we had flown into Herat or somewhere, we would be in these vehicles with the reporters going out, taking them to villages. You see the NATO flag there? I think this was the Afghan National Air Force. We took them out and let them talk to them. They could bring their interpreters or use ours. We'd take them out to communities and local villages and see how they engaged with, how NATO forces were engaging with the communities. I love this kid, that red hair. And this was the first trip I took. So this would have been London Times, Associated Press, New York Times, she was with NATO, and Washington Post. And so those guys were all based in Kabul for most of the time I was there. They were fearless. This guy, Kevin Seif with the Post, he would go out with Taliban in the mountains on his own for weeks. It was just hats off to them. And we had taken them by helicopter, then on a plane, and you're just sitting with these red strapped in to the plane until you landed. This is Wall Street Journal reporter. She's in Ukraine now covering, she later became the Moscow bureau chief for Wall Street Journal, and now she's outside of Ukraine reporting. And this was an area, a lot of times the reporters would not wear their flak jackets. We had to. Our bosses made us, but they would come and they would hate to wear anything. And they were really at risk, I thought, but they didn't like it, and these were areas where there were snipers, that anything could have happened. But they wanted to see it, so we took them out. This was in Herat, in the desert. The Herat is just flat desert sand, and this is where they did a lot of training for Afghan military commanders to teach them how to lead. If you see on the top right, there's some NATO trainers, and they were doing desert exercises and setting up these attacks, and then we would take the reporters and they would have military vehicles and guns, and they would conduct little war scenarios out in the desert. This was the last one I took. This is Herat on the western border of Iran. In some ways, Herat was a little more advanced because, like, even now, I think they're a little bit more lenient with women in education. But this was the UK Guardian, Emma and Amy from the Wall Street Journal, and Sibel was with the Deutsche Press. We took them there because we wanted to show how the Afghan forces were bringing more peaceful situations in the communities and allowing businesses to grow. So we had some business stories and companies we were taking them to. We took them to, there were women's shelters that were popping up to help abused Afghan women, which, was unheard of in the past. That just didn't happen. And so we took them there. We took them out to an ice cream factory They dressed up and bought ice cream. On the way back to the base, which was run by the Italians and the Spanish, we got to the base, and I got word that 4 American contractors had just been killed, and they were bringing them back to the base where I was taking our reporters, and to the medical clinic, actually, where the guys were being taken. And so we got in, and the whole purpose, I guess, if you're looking from the public affairs angle, you wanted the positive stories, and you wanted the business angles and the women's initiatives, but we had to go into crisis mode immediately, and they were covering the deaths. They were talking with their news directors back in Kabul. I was talking to my bosses back in Kabul, and nobody there could speak English with the Italians and the Spanish, so we couldn't do very much. But it goes to show that it's a life in the day in a war zone, because you go for one reason, tragedy hits, they're covering that story. But even then, we get back, and that week they covered the other stories that we were hoping they would get. It became almost, a daily event. Someone was having some issues somewhere with insider attacks. This was an example of just one other story that I helped handle. While I was there, there was a couple of Marines, I believe, American soldiers, no doubt, that was cleaning up, and in a burn pit, they accidentally burned a Quran, which was totally against any Islamic law tradition, and the way it was handled was wrong. And it set off a firestorm of complaints and anger throughout, and another round of insurgent attacks. We called them insider attacks. So sometimes you did not know an Afghan who should have been on our side, we thought was on our side because we had an Afghan National Army or Air Force, but they were insurgents wearing the Afghan government uniforms, and so you never knew. And so we were pulled in. We would go out to these ministries throughout Kabul, visit. We had experts that would go out and help train government officials and at all levels. And after that, we were just rolled in. But that was a very heated situation. That was life or death attacks after that.
So you're there trying to convince people that the Americans were wanting them to have a better life, a better country. Were they receptive to that?
The ones I worked with and everyone they were open to that, because they knew what life was like before under the Taliban. And it wasn't perfect. Of course, there was still poverty. There was still danger. It was not a great situation, but it had improved for so many of the people that they were heading in that direction. There were democratic elections that they hadn't had before. We went out and covered those, and they would be waving their purple fingers to show that they had voted. So many of us that were there, part of the mission became helping them, increasing rights for women and girls, and building democratic institutions where they could govern themselves. All these were going on, and thousands and thousands of people, Afghan civilians, worked with the NATO allies and trusted us and believed it was moving that way until the withdrawal that I think took a lot of people by surprise.
That was almost exactly 7 months ago today.
It's hard to believe, yeah.
Overnight, the Americans and other nations' forces had been withdrawn earlier, but the Americans were the last to leave, and they pretty much disappeared overnight. Mm-hmm. You were in Hattiesburg when that happened.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly where I was, but I remember immediately watching the news and the network of people I worked with who were all back by now, but they were journalists, they were former State Department officials, they were special forces guys, they were NGO, humanitarian workers, all these people who were back, and we kind of kept in touch. Everybody was just glued to this and immediately worried because of the changes, and worried for the Afghans who worked with us. I think that was the biggest concern. You remember that's a terrible picture, but the Afghans hanging from the cargo jet because they were so desperate. They knew what was coming. I talked to one of my former translators who, they were running in the streets that week because Taliban were rolling in on the streets and they were beating people. A friend told me that her family member saw a woman and a child were pulled out of the car by the Taliban, beaten and thrown into a ditch that week. It was just chaos, and people were trying to reach their families and they just couldn't get in touch.
Well, based on your watching the media coverage of that event and your contacts that you continued to have with people who had been there and people who were there, do you think that the media accurately reported what was going on?
I think so. I think so. They may not have gotten it all, but I think there were many on the ground. There were many trying to get out. And I think from the journalists I spoke with afterwards and watching their coverage, they were outraged. Journalists, we were talking earlier, the sense of objectivity you have. The journalists, they were objective reporters, but they were so engaged with this and their people. They had Afghan translators, of course. They had Afghan drivers. They had Afghan people who cared for their yard. They knew them. They knew their families. They knew the Afghan translators that worked with us and the intelligence people. And they knew what happened under the first Taliban regime was coming for them, especially because they were seen as collaborators with the West.
Tell us, for people who may not be familiar with it, what was life like for a young woman or even a young married woman under the Taliban before? What was their outlook?
I didn't talk a lot with them, but I didn't have that many that were living there at the time that spoke English. But from the stories we hear in the reporting, they were very restricted. Women didn't have rights. They were bought and sold as young girls, as wives. They were, I think I even have a picture later on of a girl whose nose was cut off. And once when I was there, one girl, some of this was going on even now. Even during the years I was there, the culture had not totally changed, but there was a young girl who was brutalized and mutilated for doing something very simple that women here would do all the time, or going out with a guy she loved, that was just seen as inappropriate. But so many restrictions. When I was there, of course, you saw women were gaining positions in the Afghan government more and more frequently. There was, I worked with an Afghan female Air Force pilot. They were starting to drive. They were voting. They were getting out and having jobs. They were walking around less with burqas. All of these things were developing, and for decades they've been living this way. Mm-hmm. And then overnight, it changed, or it started to change. You remember the bombing and hundreds of casualties and the 13 Marines that were killed. This is the airport in Kabul where I flew out of there many times, and where they had welded the gate shut and people were there. So, for example, the first week you had asked about, I had one of my interpreters in the public affairs department had family there. They were all Afghan Americans, so they got out. Everybody with power, influence, and money got out. Ghani left. All his ministers, their kids were in school outside of the country, so they were pretty safe, or they could get out pretty quickly. But it's that next level, the people who worked for us, who came to the ISAF bases and then went back to their homes, and it was a small community. People knew who worked for the Americans or the British or ISAF. And so when this happened and all the Taliban were in there and they were shutting down the Air Force, you couldn't get into the street. They were in hiding because the Taliban were just taking over. And I was working with several people I knew there were groups working quietly trying to get proper paperwork and documentation so if they got to the airport, they could get on a plane. But people were desperate and they couldn't get it in. So get the paperwork in. So I was working with our translator, trying to get her family of maybe 10 people, her sister, her brother-in-law, their kids, their older mother, babies. And it was in the middle of the night. We got all the paperwork. I submitted it. And they were telling people once they had that, go to this place, go to this hotel lobby and wait for a call. It was in the middle of the night. So I'm telling them, I said, I can't guarantee you're going to get on a flight, but they were so desperate. They risked going through the streets with the Taliban attacking them or killing them to get there. And they waited 24 hours in a hotel for calls that never came, and they never got on through the airport. And that happened over and over and over. And so many friends of mine I know were working in different groups to get these people, and very few actually got through. And so they are there even now, and starting to face some of the things that you were talking about with the Afghan officials making more rules and restrictions. I can show that a little bit, but like this was the girl that the first time around her nose was cut off for violating some Taliban restriction. And that's what, this was the cover. What happens if we leave? What happened the first time when the Taliban was in the regime, and what happens now when we leave? And I think that's what everyone was so afraid of, the journalists included. They said it's going to be a slaughter, a massacre, and there's not going to be any media in there to report on it. The Afghan media are going to be squashed. Western journalists are going to be out. We won't know what's going on. And we don't have any numbers. We don't know what's happening except for anecdotal evidence that's getting out, stories, people calling their families who are in the States or somewhere else. And you hear things. That first week, one of the first things, this is where it had gotten to. Women had gotten to where they are, the robotics team. That was an amazing story. They got out. But women who were in public life was being allowed for the last few decades. And now with the Taliban, the first thing they did was start blacking out the faces of women on billboards.
I want to ask you, how foreseeable was the, you showed the pictures of the local Afghan military being trained up and prepared to keep order in the country. But their keeping order lasted about 15 minutes. And before the Taliban took over. How foreseeable was that? Among what you saw and what the people you worked with, did they know that was going to happen?
I don't see how they could not have known. I wasn't working in high-level intelligence. I would hear things, but we knew that the Afghan military, because we would take reporters out to see how they were developing, they were not as advanced as the U.S. military, of course. But they were also very dependent on our training, our fixing vehicles, because they weren't trained mechanics to know how to fix a Humvee or a tank, So if that went down, they wouldn't be able to use it, an aircraft. They were learning building pilot forces, but they couldn't fix an airplane. So once we withdraw and you withdraw the whole support structure, even if the Taliban had not taken all the weapons and the machinery and all of that, they probably weren't enough trained Afghans to the level that they could to manage that alone. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And it's hard. The journalists, of course, like I said, they were kind of a blooming force, growing and expanding and questioning their government, just like journalists do here. But as soon as the Taliban, this was even before, this was last fall, they were concerned about it. But we heard that as many journalists that could evacuate did. This one was, he wasn't even a journalist. He posted something on Facebook. And he was being, I think I've seen the video of this guy, and there was another guy with him, that they were just they had bruises all over their body, because you may have seen the Taliban with those long sticks. They just beat them. But he must be a lucky one. I did a National Press Club event a few months back with some journalists who covered Afghanistan and the head of TOLA, which is a news network, and they were all saying how he was saying the Taliban, of course, came in immediately to the news offices. They blocked the female news anchors. They were sent home initially. They imposed all these new restrictions. I think recently they stopped allowing certain dramas. It's all coming back under that strict Taliban law. It's like inch by inch by inch. And I think I've heard from another woman who works with Media there said that all of the top level female news anchors have left the country and they've replaced them. There are some women still on air, but they're a lot younger, and the stories they're covering are just very mild. So it's changing already. And this concerns me so much with the women's rights and girls. And I think we'd mentioned this before, but I've heard stories of this. I even saw a video of a young girl being pulled by Taliban out of her family. They were screaming, just pulled off to be sold to or given to Afghan fighters. And that was one of the first things we heard. And imagine if you have sisters or daughters that have lived for the last 20, 30 years under basically freedom and rights or learning that, and you could go to school, you could do whatever you want, but overnight you're back in that system where you could be sold you could be a 15-year-old girl sold or given to a Taliban fighter as a sex slave.
That's profound, but in the interest of time, we're going to do a big shift now because a lot of folks in our audience are not going to be doing what you did in Afghanistan, but they are going to be doing what you've been doing more recently, and that is working in crisis communications for major corporations.
Do you really want to?
Yeah, they really want to.
It's
yeah.
exciting.
And you've worked for FedEx and for Royal Caribbean. Mm-hmm. So we're going to go to questions in just a minute, but if you will briefly just talk about what it's like being that bridge between corporate interests and public's curiosity.
Or journalist curiosity. First of all, crisis becomes, for a company like FedEx, and it did develop with Royal Caribbean with the issues that we had, it becomes, if you're considering it, a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, round the clock job that you're always looking to protect your company's interests. So, and with big companies, they're global companies, things are happening around the clock. And you're privy to information that the public does not see. Sometimes you're privy to information and details about very bad incidents that nobody in the company knows except the highest level officers and legal department. So when you go into these companies, you do sign the security statements that you won't talk about them, so I have to be careful about what I say. But a lot of this is just public record. You see major catastrophes and events that happen. You're the person that the media call for a response. And so if you're looking at what it's like, reporters will talk, and sometimes you'll have professors or experts come and say, the best thing to do is to be completely transparent. There's a lot about focus on transparency, but I've yet to see many businesses who you cannot be completely transparent from the start because you don't know all the facts. So typically what you do with media when they come and ask you if there was a casualty or a incident about pollution or anything, a social issue that's taken negatively. Those are issues that you may not have all the details, or the company has not fully defined their stance. So you have some basic statements. If you look at any kind of issue, you can look and see what people are saying, the companies are saying. They're very generic. Yes, we are aware of this. We're looking into it. We're investigating. We're resolving this part of the issue. We're taking care of the people. We'll get back with you with more information. So as a former reporter, I think that's one of the hardest things I had to deal with. I wanted to get with the reporters and tell them everything I knew and say, hey, we're taking care of it. We care. But you can't always do that. You never really know which reporters are going to give you a fair shot or which are, may spin things their way and may not be fair or positive for the company. So
how important is truth-telling?
Oh, you have to tell the truth. Yeah, you're burned if you don't. You have to. You may not tell all the truth, everything you know, but you have to be honest. I mean, the best experiences I've had is building relationships with reporters I know and trust, the ones who regularly cover your cause. You have to get to know them, and you they have to trust you. So even if you're unable to tell them details, they won't slam you as hard. They will be fair. They'll wait for information. Give them something they can use, some statement, any information, and then provide it to them as much as you can.
I was thinking when you were talking about the 24 hours a day, 7 days a week thing, that we had somebody from FedEx one time that had the numbers of how many miles FedEx vehicles drive every day and how many drivers they have and how many packages they deliver. And it was, you may know those numbers and you may not, but it was astounding that they didn't have more problems than you did. And I think they do 360 takeoffs and landings at the Memphis airport every day. We want to thank Melissa for being here, and we want to open this to questions that you may have. If you do have a question, please raise your hand and allow someone to bring you a microphone so that we can preserve this for the record. We have a question over here, and let's start back there.
Are you all journalism marketing students here? Great.
I would assume
Great.
so. So this is kind of a basic question, but I was just wondering, like, what made you go from like hardcore journalism, like political journalism, straight into like crisis communications? Because I'm an IMC major, and so what was the appeal of marketing for you versus like straight out of politics?
It was a war. No, it was, honestly, I never intended to go into PR, media relations. I was not interested in that. I'm not interested in spinning for a company or, you see all the TV shows with PR people and they spin and they seem untruthful or sneaky. That never interested me. So when I left reporting, it was also a time in Washington where the journalism was changing rapidly, and a lot of major news organizations were laying off people. It was a time of change. So with my skills, what most people do was going into some kind of public relations and media. And so I wanted to stay as much as I could within news and that daily, the current events issues. And so when I did that, like I said, I was studying documentary production. And so I was interested in doing something more real, But then this opportunity came up in Afghanistan. It was public affairs, but I saw, okay, this is history in the making. I have a chance. I'm not a reporter, but I can be there in the middle and see it and support our troops and work with journalists. And so it wasn't just going to a high-pitched marketing sales position. It was working with journalists. And so, of course, I worked for the government. I was pitching the party line, right? But I could be honest in what I was showing them when we had the 4 contractors killed. I gave them the information. I provided. I helped them do their story for that. But I also gave them another side of what was going in the war, another angle of what was going on in the country that we were working in. So, you're not a complete sellout if you go from journalism to PR. I think you can be honest, provide information of public service, and do it honestly.
We do think of both of those as service careers. There was a question back here.
Sort of riffing off of her question, I was wondering if you'd ever felt like your loyalties were tested between the two careers. If so, what was that like for you?
My loyalties to who?
Between like reporting and journalism, and sort of your only loyalty being to the readers and the audience, to government and PR.
It's hard. It really is hard because that's so ingrained in you especially this man was my teacher. I remember a class, the one thing that always comes back to mind is when you're writing an article and you're quoting someone, you can't say, well, the guy sneered that he didn't like Donald Trump. It was like, you have to say, he said. The message that I learned and I took with me was, it's objective. You may have your own opinion and bias, but when you're reporting, you report as fairly and as accurately as you can without coloring it with your own opinion. And so when I was reporting, that's what was always on my mind and what I aimed to do. And it's hard when you're reporting or when you're representing an organization or a company, and it's you're not doing that anymore. And you're working with reporters who are doing that. You know what they're trying to do and you want to help them. But you have to represent whoever's hiring you. Now you've got to decide when you go work for someone if you think they're honest and fair and they're doing a good thing or whatever goes along with your values, and if it's something you can do with a good conscience. But it's not always easy to switch over. I've talked to many reporters who've had to make that switch for financial reasons. You can't always report. It's a hard life. But many have done it, and I think they carry their values in a way that other people who do PR and marketing may not have had that journalistic experience. They approach things differently.
Those were excellent questions. Thank you. Are there others?
She's back.
Well, let's go down here, and then we'll come back to you.
Hi.
Hi.
Would you say that crisis communications has become more difficult in a world where everybody can plaster their message across digital channels and there's much less ability to gatekeep?
What do you think? 20 years ago, if you're I don't know if they even had crisis people. I think a lot of times communications directors or managers would just jump in, and still do in many companies, just come in and handle crisis events. I may have been in a position of a few who was just a totally dedicated crisis team. 20 years ago, you just put out press releases. You didn't have 24-hour news, and you didn't have Twitter and Facebook, and things weren't going 24/7. You could have a crisis event, put out a press release, and wait, and things would kind of die down. You'd have the evening news or the morning news, and that'd be it. So now you still have that, but then you have constant. So what we were talking about as far as when you have a crisis event, say Ole Miss or FedEx or Royal Caribbean has a crisis, it's not like you can just sit back and wait and see which way the public opinion goes, because that story is gone without you. If you don't have, I used to tell my team, we need a statement within 10 minutes, a holding statement for any media who call. When I worked at FedEx, we had a plane that crashed in Florida. Immediately, we had a big board. Those telephones just lit up. We had 100 press calls, I think, within 30 minutes, all wanting to know what happened. Was there any injury? Everything. And we didn't even have all the facts. We found out about it, my team found out by watching the news. We didn't get it from our safety people. It's because it's happening that fast, it's being tweeted that fast, videos are going viral immediately. So it has changed, and you have to be able to turn on a dime, speak to the media and give them something, and then coordinate across your company. So if you're in a crisis position, you're working with your legal department. You've got a lawyer that's going to tell you can say this, you can't say this to the press. You're working with safety and security who says, yes, these are the people who have died. These are the ones who have survived. You can release these names or you can't. You're working with customer service they may be getting calls from customer service. How is this going to affect my packages in Florida? And you really, it's exciting in crisis because you are working at the highest levels of the company, and you're working in every department. You've got your fingers in what everybody's doing, and you have this knowledge, and then you have to figure out what of that can you say to the public and to the reporters to present your company in the best light and give the reporters and the public what they need to know. But it's fast.
Quickly. We have to pay her overtime if she...
I'm sorry I'm talking so long. I haven't thought about these things in ages. You guys are really sparking.
Since you've worked in both fields, I know there are a lot of students here, so what would be your most general best piece of advice for people who are going into a field that you're in, but with social media and access to a lot more, and will be a lot more as we're entering the field and growing?
What would be my advice to someone who's going into it now, or
who's going to go into it, and this is what, as of now, we want to do?
I think it's get as much experience in as many different avenues as you can. I mean, one of the best things we did here that you guys taught us was, even though it was a different world, we had the best equipment and technology at the time. We learned to carry that 3/4 inch deck out and shoot videos and interviews. We learned to edit it. We learned to write the stories and do the interviews. We learned to anchor. We learned all those things. And then we were encouraged to go do internships. So it's the same thing today. You've got different tools, but learn your tool. Learn how to post. Watch. I still do it. I watch what other companies do when there's a crisis and whether they post on Twitter or whether they're, what's showing up, how quickly they respond. Just be an observer of these incidents that happen. Okay, last night, or the Oscars, Will Smith slaps Chris Rock. Who saw that? Who knows what Chris Rock said after? Did he put out a statement? Did Will Smith? What did they say about it? Did they apologize? I've seen nothing. Did anybody put out a statement? Okay. Academy Awards put something out because they got something at risk, their award. So they put something out, and I saw it today. Maybe it wasn't right away. So there is some delay.
It came out today, the Academy statement.
But so to your statement, just look and see who does it right, who does it wrong. Alec Baldwin, when he shot the guy on the film set, watch how he responded. Watch what statements he put out. Did it work? Did it not work? I would say just learn as much as you can. You can do it by your own observation. Work with people who do it. Go take internships. And just learn your craft and learn the tools you have current day.
Well, that's great advice. And we want to thank you for being here.
That was fast, you guys. Thank you. Okay. Good luck.